Yellow and Red Mix by Digits 27. Chapter 19. The old man, peeping on the woman's side of the hot springs, immediately froze in place, cringing forwards ever so slightly. He turned, expecting a seething woman that would no doubt want to kick him as hard as they could across the village. This was just paranoia, of course. If he had actually thought about it, then he would have disregarded such an idiotic notion. Firstly, there couldn't have been a woman on this side of the springs in the first place, and secondly, the voice was far too masculine. Instead, it was with great relief that he turned only to see a 14-year-old kid with spiky blonde hair eerily reminiscent of, "Hey, I told you to stop peeping, you pervert." Naruto finally got a good look at the old man as he turned. He was surprisingly large for his size, intrinsically thanks to years of training to recognize such things. Naruto immediately knew that it was muscle, not fat. The way he held himself, despite his previous cowardly posture, spoke of power and expectations of the inherent respect that came along with it. However, more surprises than that to Naruto was the fact that after a good look at the man's face, he actually recognized the man. How could he not? After all, he was the author of Naruto's all-time favorite series. "Oh hey, you're Jiraiya of the Sannin." The man beamed, obviously extremely happy at being recognized. "Yeah, I recognized you from the author's shot at the end of the book." The man's eyes grew even wider and his smile more radiant as he looked down at one of his loyal readers. I figured a guy who writes books like that would be some kind of super pervert. Before Naruto even fully realized what was happening, he found himself enveloped in one of the largest and most bone-crunching hugs he could remember. "I have found him. I have found the person who truly understands me." Jiraiya pulled out of the hug and stared at Naruto with watery eyes and the same beaming grin. Naruto just tried to wriggle out of the awkward grasp while an abnormally large sweat drop hung from his head. It dawned on him that he was still wearing little more than a bath towel around his midsection, and he increased his struggles tenfold. It was in vain, though. The old man's vice-like grip was impenetrable. Like his arms were made of actual steel. Gah! "Get off me, you old perv!" Jiraiya quickly got off of the young boy, but only because he noticed that people were starting to stare in their direction. Outwardly, he was still beaming like a child who worked out how to get into the cookie jar. "Kid, you're one in a million. Maybe I should make you my student. No, better yet, my apprentice. No, wait. Even better, my protege." Naruto just widened his eyes and started to take slow but deliberate steps away from the eccentric and possibly crazy Sannin. Suddenly, another thought struck Naruto as he backed away from Jiraiya. "Hey, wait, you're a Sannin, right?" Finally, the older man was knocked out of his little fantasy world, and he curtly nodded at Naruto with that idiotic smirk. "That's right, kid. You have the privilege of looking at the one and only Toad Sage, Jiraiya of the Sannin." Naruto could have sworn he heard fireworks after the man announced himself, but he quickly shook his head of it. Right. Jiraiya's face fell a bit at the stiffly dismissive and unimpressed tone in Naruto's voice. "And so, that means you know Orochimaru, right?" Suddenly, Jiraiya was all business, and as his demeanor immediately shifted to a more professional tone, Naruto was genuinely surprised, as he wouldn't have thought this old perv had a professional bone in his body. "Why are you asking me about my former teammate?" He said the word former with a small amount of spite, and Naruto contemplated whether or not bringing the obviously touchy subject up, and then had a good idea. He gulped down his anxiety and plowed on in a very traditional Naruto-esque way. "He killed Gaara's father, so I want to put a kunai between his shoulder blades." Jiraiya scrutinized the boy before him with an incredibly stern and piercing gaze before his eyes finally softened and he let out a small chuckle. "Hey, join the ever-increasing club, kid." Naruto narrowed his eyes and sighed. "So you have no idea where he is?" It was said hopefully, despite Naruto already knowing the answer. Jiraiya just shook his head in response, and Naruto felt his mood worsening even further, and to think that hot springs were supposed to be relaxing. Now that the old Sannin had no useful information for him, Naruto had returned to the uncomfortable state he was in before. "Oh well, alright then." With that, Naruto just turned on his heel and started making his way back to the springs. "Hey, wait up, brat!" Naruto couldn't help but wince. The insult didn't exactly help make him want to comply with the pervert's wishes, so he kept walking. Jiraiya overtook him, turning to face him, and simultaneously blocked Naruto's way out of the springs. I said wait up." Naruto shrugged innocently with a plainly disinterested look on his face. "Yeah, I heard you, but if you can't trade me, then I have no real interest." Jiraiya's eyes seemed to widen at almost impossible sizes as he stared down at Naruto, who once again grew uncomfortable under the strange gaze. "Are you kidding me, kid? I'm Jiraiya of the legendary Sannin. I've been and fought in all 5 hidden villages, visited every land in the elemental nations, and faced enemies that would make you cower in fear." He looked a bit more smug now. However, Naruto managed to maintain his emotionless mask and reply in a completely deadpan voice. Doesn't make you a good teacher." Jiraiya managed to accumulate a large drop on the side of his head that may or may not have been condensated from the springs. Yeah, well, kid, I can show you a thing or two. His cocky, overconfident persona was now back in place as he took purposely strides towards the unoccupied spring Naruto had been sitting in minutes ago. When he reached the edge of the water, he just kept going, purposely striding out until he was in the center of the water. See, how's that for a... Sorry, were you saying something? Jiraiya turned around, agitated at the boy's offhanded tone. However, he was briefly put off when he saw that Naruto was doing. He too was on the surface of the water, except he was standing on top of a kunai, which pointed down on top of the water surface. Naruto just lazily yawned as Jiraiya's eyebrow twitched, and a few hot spring patrons clapped at the impressive display. Oh, well, it seems you have chakra control exercises down at least. Naruto's eyes narrowed slightly, believing the man to have completely wasted his time so far. At least he had stopped the man from peeping, even if he was probably going to go straight back to it as soon as he left. Like I said, he didn't going to teach me anything. He didn't bother to finish the sentence as he hopped off the kunai onto the stone floor of the bathing area and quickly hurried towards the changing room. He was fully dressed and on his way out by the time Jiraiya snapped out of his grumbling trance and caught up. Well, kid, you mentioned Gaara before. That wouldn't happen to be Gaara no Sabuki, son of the late Kazekage, would it? Naruto didn't bother turning to face the man, but he did quirk an eyebrow at the mention of his friend. I asked because you seem to know so much about me, and yet I know so little about you. Naruto stopped walking in the middle of the street to look at Jiraiya without even attempting to hide his bemusement. Really? Then guess all that stuff I read about your supposedly vast spy network was exaggerated then. Naruto shrugged in an amused fashion and carried on, a smile down on his face. Orochimaru wasn't the only Sonian that Naruto had decided to research. He was a little disappointed with Jiraiya didn't even seem fazed and matched Naruto step for step. Maybe you're right, Naruto. The younger boy smirked, knowing that the Sonian was baiting him. He hadn't given his name after all. You know, I'm almost a little flattered that whoever your parents were, they named you after the title after my first story. Naruto's breath hitched a little, but he quickly covered it up with a cough that seemed to go unnoticed by his unwanted companion. Whoever my parents were, another hole in the network. Jiraiya just shrugged nonchalantly, and despite their awkward and strange initial encounter, Naruto actually found himself warming up to the older man. It was nice to have someone to banter with who wouldn't use a curse word every other sentence. So kid, where you headed? A remarkably perverted grin erupted on Jiraiya's face, and Naruto sighed, not liking where this was going. You meeting up with a lady friend per se? Naruto grimaced, but didn't say anything, which only caused Jiraiya's grin to spread to almost comical properties, as he quickly lost himself in whatever sick fantasy was going through his mind. While curious, Naruto found himself desperately not wanting to know what the man was thinking about, especially if it involved him. After about 30 minutes of walking in highly awkward silence, Naruto finally arrived at the Inuzaka compound. It was late and he was tired, and surprisingly Jiraiya just kept walking after Naruto stopped. Apparently, still lost in his perverted dreamland, Naruto just counted his blessings as the perverted son walked off with a goofy grin while he slipped into the compound via the gate. He sighed an enormous breath he didn't even realize he had been holding as he leaned against the large wooden gate. Naruto walked across the grounds of the compound, unsure of what to do with himself. It was late, but not enough that he felt the need to sleep just yet. He could train, but last time he did that he disturbed Hana, and he didn't want to do that to any other passing Inuzaka. Now that he thought about it, he wasn't even sure why he had come back to the compound. He had simply followed his feet on instinct. His thoughts trailed back to Hana and her offer earlier in the week. He reddened as he thought about it, but if she was here in the compound, then it was probably a good time. He lazily altered his course to head to the veterinary practice tucked away in the corner of the estate. He knew this was going to be even more awkward and uncomfortable than talking to Jiraiya, but he grit his teeth and kept walking. His last thought before he entered was on what Tayuya might be doing right about now. She was hunkered over in the darkest corner of the alley, using the shadows as a shroud to conceal herself. She wouldn't call it cowering herself, but in essence, it was what she was doing as she sat curled up in her own arms. She gripped her legs fiercely, nearly drawing blood with how hard her nails pressed her skin. It was all she could do to stop herself rocking backwards and forwards like a PTSD patient. It isn't human. Nothing could follow me that fast and break all those genjutsus. She tried to take her mind off of it by thinking how she got here. They were running across rooftops, although sprinting would have been more accurate, and Tayuyo was weaving in and out of every passage she could find in an attempt to lose her pursuer. She gained a small amount of ground and ducked into a nearby alleyway, forming a very familiar cross seal with her hands as she did so. The shadow clone raced off in the opposite direction, and soon after it, the platinum blonde girl. She sighed in relief from her position on the cold, slight down floor. At least that should take care of her problem for the foreseeable future. When she saw Naruto tonight, she was going to have to thank him for teaching her that jutsu. She stood up and brushed herself off, not really bothering by the small amount of dirt on her clothing, but she knew the smell would annoy Naruto later. She stopped herself on that thought. She had always been rather considerate about Naruto's heightened senses, but he had never gone out of her way to avoid making him uncomfortable. In fact, most of the time the exact opposite was true in most other situations. It only struck her was odd because this was the first time it had happened. She managed to brush it off with the rest of the dirt on her clothes and walked out of the alley, straight into the smiling face of one Ino Yamanaka. "There you are, Tayuya." Naruto heard the scream that echoed throughout the village. That he also faintly noticed that the voice was somewhat familiar. However, in his current state, he barely cared. His face was a shade of red that would make a tomato blush, and he would still be redder. His eyes were so wide that he couldn't actually physically close them, and the only thing that kept his jaw from simply dropping to the ground was the constraints of biology. He walked in a very stiff and robotic manner towards his accommodations, his mind far gone from what his eyes were seeing as he walked. Everything that Hana had told him rushed through his mind. Unfortunately, so did the visual aids she used in horrifically vivid detail. Naruto couldn't stop his eyes twitching as he thought about the mechanics of what she had been trying to explain. Naruto now firmly wished he had ignored his own curiosity and taken his ignorance to the grave. He flopped down on the bed, only offhandedly noticing that Tsukiyo wasn't there, which was probably for the best considering what he now knew. Sleeping in the same bed as his female friend now took on a whole new perspective in his mind as the connotations of such actions was revealed to him. He was actually just glad that I didn't need to resort to using a friend who apparently would have been more than happy to give him some kind of demonstration. To say Naruto was shell-shocked by the entire affair was definitely an understatement. With an exasperated sigh, he flopped his head down on the mattress, hoping that sleep would just claim him as he could put off dealing with this until the morning. Luckily, the entire ordeal had been exhausting, and not soon after that the sweet and merciful embrace of sleep took him. Naruto sighed as he woke up for the fourth time in a row without the vibrant locks in his face. Her waking up early normally would have concerned him. It told him something was very wrong. However, all he could do was sigh and be mildly annoyed, mostly because he knew the reason was him. He wasn't entirely sure why she was avoiding him, but he had a very strong idea it had something to do with that kiss up on the Hokage monument. He wanted to talk to Takia about it, but she had been avoiding him ever since. It really didn't help that he found it down at night on impossible to locate her scent in the veritable hive of activity that was Konoha. His specific training had hit a dead end with Hinata, so on that end he was stuck. The only thing he could do concerning the finals was train the skills he already had. Then again, Jiraiya really was a Sanin. It couldn't have hurt too much to get one or two techniques from the man. He merely shrugged. That too was a lost cause as he had no idea where the man was, so it was pointless thinking about it. He got up and showered, figuring he would go out and find Gaara sparring with him, always cheering him up. He looked back at the previous day's events. Now with some hindsight, he was actually taking in the knowledge Hana had given him. He might have overreacted just a little. She had explained that it was all perfectly natural, so really he had nothing to worry about. Somehow that didn't quite settle his nerves on the whole affair with the Yuya, but he put it in the back of his mind for now. He quickly got dressed and ran out of the compound, hoping that he wouldn't run into Hana. He didn't think any differently of her now, except as a female, but he figured it would be slightly awkward to talk right now. Once he out of the compound, he took to the rooftops. Normally, he would head straight to the training grounds, but Gaara's scent was definitely somewhere in the village. He was just lucky he didn't have the same issue with the Leaf Village that Naruto did. He could walk around in public. The only strange looks he would receive were due to the enormous gourd constantly strapped to his back. Naruto quickly caught up to the sand wielder and gulped when he realized who he was with. He settled with a brisk walk next to his friends, him on one side of Gaara and Takuya on the other. "Hey, Gaara." Gaara nodded, and Takuya just grunted something inaudible. Awkward silence settled over the three until surprisingly Gaara decided to break the ice. "So, Naruto, have you found any way to combat the Hyuga style?" Naruto hung his head a little. "No, I can't find anybody to teach me about it." Takuya scoffed loudly from her position on the other side of Gaara. "Well, duh, it's not like they're going to just teach you all their weaknesses." Naruto hung his head lower, still seeing as that was in essence what Hinata had told him. However, he smiled anyway, glad that Takuya didn't seem to be avoiding him anymore. "So, what are you going to do?" Naruto just looked up at Gaara with a fair gleam and a broad grin. "You know me, I'll just swing it." Takuya scoffed again, but kept her opinion to herself this time. "So, Gaara, want to spar?" The smaller boy seemed pleased with the idea, but a different thought seemed to come to mind, and he shook his head. "I'm afraid I can't. I have my own training to do." When he saw Naruto's exaggerated puppy dog look, he gave a small smirk. "There will be plenty of time for that in the last fight of the finals." Naruto nodded happily at that, even though it might have made him even slightly cocky about his chance of reaching the last fight. "We could spar." Naruto looked over at Takuya a little surprised. In fact, the girl seemed surprised herself that she had even made the comment. It was more out of instinct in these situations, but Naruto wasn't going to give her the chance to take back the offer. "Great!" Before Takuya could properly react to even fight back, Naruto had her arm and had thrown her onto his back in a makeshift piggyback. Gaara watched as they were there 1 second and gone the next, only the slight flittering of loose papers on the street telling him they had moved. Gaara smirked, knowing that Takuya's reaction would be when they came to a stop. He looked around a moment to check nobody else, and seeing the speedy departure before heading off to a nearby but deserted training ground to perfect the technique he had been working on. Takuya got off of Naruto's back a little shakily. Her hair was slightly less orderly than it had been when they had left, and even managed to gain a few leafy ornaments during transit. She took a moment to allow the world to stop wobbling quite as much before she run on Naruto angrily. "You know I hate it when you do that, shithead." Naruto just nodded while shrugging carelessly. "Yeah, but you also say you fight better when you're mad." Takuya was about to retort, but she had no good comeback for that. Instead, her eyes narrowed evenly with a small smirk briefly danced across her features. She reached behind her and drew out her flute from its latest pouch almost reverently before settling it against her lips. Naruto didn't seem in the least bit phased. "Come on, Takuya, you know genjutsu doesn't affect me in combat." Takuya's evil smile turned at these words like she had been waiting for them. "Oh, who said anything about a genjutsu?" She blew delicately on the flute with a very specialized sequence of air holes held down on, and the effect was immediate. To any normal listener, no sound emerged from the thin instrument, but to Naruto, his senses were flooded by a deafening white noise that immediately had him on the ground, clutching the sides of his head in pain. After seeing Naruto writhe around for a solid 30 seconds, Takuya finally stopped the torture and allowed Naruto to shakily get to his feet, much in the same way that she had done prior. He glared at Takuya while she wiggled a finger in his ear, a look of pain still evident on his face, while he waited for the ringing to stop. "That wasn't funny, Takuya," she smiled, a genuine happy smile despite his rather heated gaze. "I beg to differ, shithead. Pretty hilarious, actually." His eyes softened, and his own smile managed to worm its way onto his face. He had missed this kind of interaction in the last few days, even though he could probably do without the ear-splitting headache. Fine. Are we going to fight properly now?" She just looked amused, crossing her arm over her chest and leaning back slightly as she looked at Naruto with a grin. Naruto couldn't help but notice the placement of her arms as his eyes drifted down before he forcefully returned them to her face. "What the hell are you talking about? I won!" Naruto looked playfully hurt. "That's it. That was hardly a fight, Taiyo. She smiled again and disinterestedly looked down at her nails. Ignore Naruto. Yeah, you're right. Next time, come at me with more of a challenge. It was said playfully, but when she looked at Naruto was gone, without showing too much emotion, she looked around a little worried by the sudden disappearance. Just as suddenly he had vanished, Taiyo felt the presence barreled into her from behind, and soon she was on the ground, straddled by Naruto, as he held her down, arms down, grinning wildly. Okay, how's this then, Tahiya-chan? She glared at him for the name and struggled underneath him but he was a lot stronger than she was, and his grip wouldn't budge. Eventually, she let her head drop to the ground with an irritated grunt, and Naruto stood off of her, still smiling manically. He offered her his hand, and after a few moments of Tahiya's version of pouting, which included trying to kick Naruto in a very special area, she accepted it. Fair enough, shithead. I guess we're even today. He smiled happily, and she couldn't help but be caught up in one of those infatuated moods of his. For the briefest moments, she forgot why she had been avoiding him all this time. Of course, at that moment, the lights streaming through the treetops caught him, lighting up his hair like a radiant inferno, and she remembered, looking awkwardly down at the ground. Naruto sensed the sudden shift in her behavior, and not wanting her to start avoiding him again, he quickly tried to find the root of the problem. Hey, Tayuya, these last couple of days, Naruto, my protege, Naruto groaned as the highly overenthusiastic voice cut through the clearing like a very unwelcoming knife. Tayuya just looked around in confusion for the owner of the voice, who quickly made themselves known. This time Naruto knew he was using fireworks. There was no other explanation for the bright lights swirling around the eccentric man as he entered the clearing. Who the fuck are you? It was at that point that Jiraiya took notice of Tayuya vanishing before appearing next to her, making both the younger shinobi's eyes widen. Ah, such foul language from such a pretty young woman. Tayuya's cheeks immediately flared red at the compliment before her eyes turned murderous, and she lashed out at the man. He swiftly ducked under the blow and took a few steps away on his ridiculous Geta sandals, which seemed highly impractical for a ninja. The fuck you say to me, you ass-whipped pedophile? Jiraiya actually blanched at the insult this time, a large drop of sweat hanging on both his and Naruto's head. The old man gulped before nervously turning his attention to Naruto. I see you keep interesting company, my young apprentice. Both Naruto and Tayuya narrowed their eyes at the veiled insult, while Naruto was beginning to grow annoyed. Stop calling me that. I'm not your protege. Jiraiya put on a look of mock hurt, sticking out his bottom lip ever so slightly. Is that any way to treat your sensei? Naruto glared at him. You're not my sensei either. This time, Jiraiya pretended to be horrendously shocked in a very over-the-top comical way. After everything I've taught you. It was Naruto's turn to blanch at the older man, wondering in what direction the loony bin disguise escaped from. What the hell have you taught me? Jiraiya just snickered. What else? The art of love through my brilliant and priceless novels? Tayuya stared at the man incredulously. You're the pervert that wrote Make Out Paradise? As she said it, she drew out the aforementioned book and stared at it with a small amount of disbelief. Jiraiya, on the other hand, couldn't be more thrilled as he looked at the girl holding his book. Another of my loyal readers. He quickly turned to Naruto. This one is to keep her, boy. Never let her go. Naruto was still speechless from the whole display, not sure what to make of it. Figures. Tayuya was about to tuck the book back into a pouch, but not before Jiraiya grabbed it, quickly opened it to the back, and signed the cover. Tayuya accepted the newly signed book a little cautiously, not very wary of this man's speed. Oi, shithead, just who the fuck is this fucker? Naruto sighed. He had been about to sneak away while the other two were distracted, but he called him before he could even move a step. That's Jiraiya, one of the Sannin. Jiraiya quickly cut in, not one to let somebody else announce him. That would be legendary, Sannin. That's right, you're looking at the one, the only Toad Sage Jiraiya, breaker of hearts and wooer of women, author extraordinaire, and handsome devil, if I do so say so myself. Jiraiya, who was too caught up in his announcement, amidst Tayuya quickly had in, because nobody else will. Naruto snickered at this once again out of the notice of the carried away Sannin. Naruto motioned with his head to Tayuya, and she quickly nodded. Seconds later, the the clearing was down to Shinobi. As Jiraiya finally came out of his rant, he looked around with a cheeky grin, only for it to drop when he realized the other two had abandoned him. He scowled while looking for the direction they headed in. Not finding it, his grimace quickly became a perverted smirk. The two lovebirds probably wanted some privacy. He walked off giggling, perverted thoughts in control of his mind for the moment. Takuya and Naruto came to a rest in a different training ground, panting from the exertion of running so fast. Well, Takuya was, at least. She sometimes really hated Naruto's seemingly undrained energy, except of course when it saved her ass on missions. Not that she would ever admit she needed him. She smiled as she thought about how easily they teach the old pervert. One glance at Naruto showed that he was amused by it as well. For a Sanin, he sure as hell sucks. Naruto only nodded, smirking at Jiraiya's expense. Yeah, he's a massive pervert too. You know how I met him? Takuya waited for him to continue as he seemed to chuckle in his head about something, although his cheeks turned a little red. I caught him peeping into the lady's hot springs. Takuya's eyes opened wide in newly fond anger towards the self-proclaimed super pervert. That old bastard. Next time I see him, I'm going to rip his fucking nuts off. See if we got anything to gawk at after that. Naruto raised an eyebrow at the slightly impassive speech, but winced at her threat. What man wouldn't have after that? Even so, Naruto was fairly certain Takuya wouldn't be able to follow through on such a threat. Jiraiya was a Sanin for a reason, after all, and that title wasn't given to just anyone. However, he wisely decided to keep that little opinion to himself. He looked across at Takuya, seeing her smile, thinking about hurting Jiraiya made him happy. It was like the kiss never happened. Hey Takuya, she nodded absent-mindedly, lost in her violent fantasies. I'm sorry. She looked across at him a little strangely, trying to work out what he was talking about, so he clarified. Sorry about whatever I did to make you avoid me all this time. Takuya's eyes widened and her eyebrows raised itself in shock. He actually thinks he did something? You moron! She shocked him in turn by punching him lightly on the shoulder, not as hard as she did when actually angry with him. You didn't do anything. He looked at her. This time he was the one who was confused, and it showed him making her sigh deeply. It doesn't matter, shithead. Let's just forget it, okay? Not one to miss out a chance like this. He quickly and excitedly nodded before surprising the redhead by pulling her into a brief but warm hug. She was so shocked she didn't have a chance to struggle before he let her go, still gritting that everything could go back to the way it was. However, inside both of them knew deep down that something had changed. While neither knew what they knew, it wouldn't be so simple for things to go back to normal. She gave him a mock scowl that looked convincing enough in payback for the hug before recomposing herself. Yeah, well, you still got fuck tons of training to do, so might as well get started. He just nodded happily, and once again she couldn't help but smile along with him. It was like the last 7 years never happened, and they were those two young runaways on the road again. End of chapter 19.